welcome to the first module of the first class of Organizational Development Psych 576. I'm going to briefly just kind of hit the high points of the syllabus. Please note that there is both the syllabus available on Blackboard Online as well as a syllabus walkthrough where I discuss some of the higher points. And then I'm really going to focus on the initial stages of organizational development, kind of the broad picture of what is organizational development, and also how do we actually use our knowledge of organizational development to identify problems in a larger organization, in a larger organizational framework, and also a little bit about how we sell those problems. In other words, how do we sell the need to do change to make organizations better? So just a broad discussion of the syllabus. So this class is broken down into lectures, which you're currently listening to, which are provided both as an audio lecture and also simply a slides deck with the actual information from the slides without the actual audio portion. Readings from the textbook, which highly connect into the actual lectures. Knowledge checks or quizzes that happen at the end of each week. Discussion sections, which again, the discussions are based on the actual reading and extrapolating of an empirical article in organizational development and then discussing with your fellow students its implication in your own organizations. And finally, project papers. So every other week, a section of a large 4-part paper is due. So each one of these has their due dates in the syllabus. I do suggest that you keep a strong kind of time management on each week to make sure that you're getting all of the components of this class in. Online classes, by their very nature, are fairly self-directed, and I just want to make sure that you're keeping on top of all the material. Let me know if you're having any issues, and you can definitely shoot me an email, and we can see what we can do. So briefly, I just want to kind of talk about, and this isn't into the topic of organizational development yet, the idea of just how we learn. And learning is a process, and this is actually a part of OD. This was from your textbook, and the idea is that part of what we're doing in organizational development is we're teaching people a different way to do their organizational work, or a different way to structure an organization, or a different way to create a system within an organization. And a part of that means that to implement those interventions, we're having to teach, just as I'm doing right now, and you're having to learn. And I just kind of wanted to go over the learning process briefly, not just from an organizational development standpoint, but also from a way of looking at this class. I think a lot of people do take classes with more of a kind of very progressive A equals B equals C goal in mind. So I have this section to read, and then I have this quiz to complete, and then I have this project I have to do. And we tend to get stuck in the minutia of actually doing the projects and not necessarily thinking about, are we actually learning the material? So when we're learning, we're wanting to actually basically add additional concepts, theory, and knowledge to the base of information that we use. So when we take a class, if when we leave, it hasn't changed us at all, it's the same as an intervention in an organization that has failed. So an intervention that ends up in, after the intervention is done, the organization actually hasn't changed. It hasn't changed its behavior, it hasn't changed its knowledge base, it hasn't changed its thought processes. That's an intervention that failed. Similarly, a class that is trying to teach a new way of looking at the world, a new way to do something, a new methodology to apply, if it is never actually applied past the class itself, again, that's failed. So we want to think about, what are the key concepts that I can take away from any class that I take? How can these concepts or these theories or these practices be used in my own life, whether it's simply adding to my knowledge base by retaining the information so that it can be used later in situations, or possibly even a direct intervention in how I change how I look at the world or how I behave in certain situations. So once we've identified those concepts, what we want to do is reinforce those concepts through activities, communication, problem solving, decision making. And that's why classes usually have quizzes, discussions, papers. It's not just to create a product for the purposes of grading, it's specifically designed to hit this second activity, to reinforce the learning of the information. Now, past the activity itself, if we're really wanting to get that information into our long-term memory, if we're really wanting to incorporate it into our knowledge base, we also need to spend some time reflecting on it, analyzing, comparing, critiquing. So actually really thinking about the readings, really thinking about the lecture, trying to come up with application. And some of that's done through the activity itself, but the activity's goal is not just the structure of the activity. Its purpose is to hopefully facilitate this analyzing, comparing, and critiquing. And finally, it works best if we can then connect it to our own lives and our own organizations and our own theories. So the project, for instance, in this class, four-part project that leads to a larger paper at the end, is meant for you to tie all the concepts of this class to your own organization. And again, that's meant to connect it, that reflecting and generalizing. And when these four phases are done correct, they tend to start to create a cycle of learning. And that's really what the goal is of any class, is to give you enough information about the subject that you become your own lifelong learner. And I know that sounds kind of trite, but it really is the concept that we're trying to get across when we're taking a class, when we're constructing a class, is can I give you enough information and take you through this cycle at least a few times of here's a concept, here's an activity to reinforce that concept, and hopefully make you really think about it and apply it to your own life in such a way that now you have enough information that you can gather more information as needed to continue your learning and the use of these techniques. So organizational development and reinventing the organization, change management, you can hear a lot of these terms are kind of used interdependently. So reinventing an organization, change management, organizational development at its heart is a broad term used to basically represent a more systematic and larger scale intervention or change in an organization. So in my field, industrial organizational psychology, the entire field is about applying the science of human behavior to specific problems in organizations. But a lot of times we're really just focusing on very small parts of the organization. We might be coaching an individual leader. We may be working with one particular team that has a problem. In other words, we're often problem solving. We're being reactionary to individual problems within an organization. Organizational development, what sets it apart from other parts of the field, in theory at least, and it's a gray definition, is usually the interventions are broader in scope. In other words, they're trying to change multiple parts or an entire structural part of an organization. They're being done in such a way that they actually require the organization itself, not individuals, but the organization to make changes in how it does things, and that process is an iterative one. In other words, it usually is not a start, middle, and finish. It's usually a continuous improvement project, which is why we often refer to organizational development as a process of change management. We are trying to change the organization, and we're trying to change the organization in a way that minimizes negative impacts, because change always creates some chaos. There's always resistance to change. And one of the things we're going to talk about in this course is how to overcome that resistance, but also how to make sure that we are optimizing the actual improvements we're wanting to do. So I have a quick graphic from the book here, so kind of the cycle. There's always, the first thing that starts in organizational development is a desire to improve or change. So that's usually where things start. A recognition the way we've been doing things is not actually the most optimal or successful way. We then need to investigate the problem. So just because there's a perceived problem doesn't always mean that's actually what's causing the problem. Now, most organizations actually have outcomes, and if those outcomes are directly showing a problem, the question at this phase is what's causing that negative outcome? What's causing our retention issues? We're losing employees. What's causing our reduction in our market share? But we want to investigate it. We want to be systematic. We want to go, okay, we know there's a problem, but now where are the parts of the organization that could be changed to impact that problem, to improve that situation? Once we actually have identified where the problem is, what needs to be changed, we now explore solutions and benchmarks. So what have other organizations done? What does the research do? So this is the science part of kind of the science and practice of organizational development. The science is turning to previous research to find out what can be done. The practice is then actually implementing it into an organizational change. So at the bottom circle there, we have design interventions and results and expectations. So we've done our research, we've identified our problem, we know what we need to do. We're now actually going to design the specific interventions. Is it going to be a restructuring of the organization? Is it going to involve training? Is it going to involve a reapplication of human resources throughout the organization? And how is this actually going to be done? But also identifying what we think are going to be the results. So how is this fixing the problem? We then implement the intervention. So we actively become a change agent, if you will, in the organization, moving forward the implementation of this new intervention. And then we're going to end the phase or end the cycle with an evaluation of performance and learning. So we know there was a problem, and because we investigated that problem, we also should have benchmarks of what are the outcomes in the organization that we want to see changed. We're now actually evaluating, did those outcomes change? Have we seen improvement? If we have, we may then return to the top and decide, do we need to change again? And the answer may be no. It worked, we're doing good, our organization is solid again. But we want to always be in this kind of awareness phase of, is there going to be a further change down the road that we want to do? It may turn out that we find out actually the intervention did not have the effect we want. We still have that problem, and we're kind of back to the drawing board, but we're starting the cycle again. Okay, we still have a desire to change. We need to look at the problem again and see what we missed. So an overview of this class, we're going to talk about what is OD and how to recognize or sell the need for change. And again, one of the things to just kind of always keep in mind is that people in general tend to resist change. That doesn't mean that we won't welcome it once it comes upon us. That doesn't mean we might not grow and thrive further when we're offered the opportunity for change. But just to recognize that generally speaking, organizations usually have a culture and a history about way things are done. So organizational development, which is usually talking about a large-scale change in an organization, is naturally going to create some resistance. So it is important to be able to sell it, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what is an organizational culture and how that culture has an impact. So different organizations are going to be easier or harder to sell organizational development to. Usually younger, newer companies that are kind of in a dynamic environment. For example, currently a lot of tech startup companies are pretty open to organizational development. They're constantly in change. Organizations that have been in the same industry doing basically the same kind of products for years and years and years are usually going to be more resistant. And a part of that is going to be the actual culture of the people that work there, the processes that are in place, the structure and bureaucracy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a psychological contract. And really a psychological contract is that most people, we have written contracts in most cases where we work that defines what our job role are, what our expectations are, what our pay and benefits are. But we also have psychological constructs, what our assumptions are of what working at that organization is going to be like. And these psychological constructs need to be somewhat identified and considered in organizational development because often an organizational developmental intervention is going to be violating some of these psychological constructs of individuals in the organization. So for instance, if you came in with an understanding that in 5 years, if you did a good job, you were most likely going to be replacing your supervisor, backfilling your own position when your supervisor was promoted. And instead, 3 years into your job, there's a structural organizational change where your entire department is dissolved and each one of you is moved into a new position within the organization. Now, your job description hasn't changed, your title and pay and benefits haven't changed. None of the hard contractual information has changed in your job, but the psychological contract has been completely violated at that point. So we need to recognize that when we're moving changes, we are moving people. We're affecting people. Organizations are made out of people. And they have assumptions of what their job is supposed to look like, who they're supposed to interact with. And that doesn't mean that we are not going to ever do change because of worry of psychological contracts. It's more of we need to acknowledge that they're there and think about how can we minimize this resistance and also minimize the negative impact. So for instance, in the example I'm using, we'd probably want to actually take people that were in that original department aside and actually talk to them about, okay, here's what's going on, here's why this change is happening, and what were your expectations of the position you were currently in, and let's talk about how that will look in your new. So basically just identifying and acknowledging psychological constructs. And we're finally going to look at the 5-stage model of OD, and that's really what we're going to talk about throughout this class. This class is structured on this 5-stage model, and in fact when you're writing your four-part project paper in this class, one of the components of it is actually discussing your intervention using that 5-stage model. So we're going to briefly just talk about those phases we talked about a few slides ago, about the process of organizational development. So the first part of it is the need for change. So the idea that we are in a dynamic world, that the world is changing, that laws change, consumer needs change, and organizations that do not change with those needs, organizations that aren't aware of this dynamic system, tend to have a less likely path forward of continuing to be successful. So organizations need to recognize that there will be changes, changes in technology, changes in employee expectations, changes in how governmental regulation and even international trade will impact their business. And that the best way to handle a changing environment is to have an organization that can change with those environmental changes. So organizations are in a continuous interaction with external forces, and in short, this is what we often refer to as an open systems approach to looking at organizations. And this is probably one of the best models to think of as far as an overview model for organizational development. The idea behind this is that every organization has three major components, regardless of what that organization is, that exists in an environment. So the environment is everything external to the organization. The environment is customers, the environment is people that have never heard of the organization, the environment is people that don't currently work for the organization. The environment is the culture of the civilization that the organization exists within. It includes the government, and it also even includes the literal physical environment. So where is the organization geographically? What is all of these are factors. So everything outside the organization is the environment. And the organization, therefore, needs to not just be three structural components working blind, it also needs to have sense organs. It needs to be taking the pulse of the environment around it. So basically, open systems suggest that any organization has inputs. Inputs are what it brings into the organization from the outside. So the second something is taken from the environment, whether it's a new employee, whether it's a new customer shopping for the first time, whether it is raw materials, whether it is a new technology, all of that, when it becomes a part of the organization or it enters the organization, it's considered an input. These are things the organization basically takes in. This is the food of the organism that is the organization. So raw materials, human resources, capital and money, investments, technology, also just pure information. So this works for all organizations, including, for example, an organization that's a PR firm. So a PR firm isn't going to be bringing in raw materials as such. It's going to be bringing in new clients. It's going to be bringing in new ways to do things. It's going to be bringing in intellectual properties. Once things are brought into the organization, it becomes the second phase, the transformation process. So this is what the organization actually does. This is the employees' work activities, this is managerial activities, this is technological and operational methods. So these are all the structures that the organization does internally, generally for the purpose of turning an input into an output. And the output is what the organization actually produces: products and services, financial results, information that is disseminated back to the environment, human results, and impact. Now, again, thinking of an organization as an organism, we have what it takes in, what it does with it, and what are the products that it produces. And then there's the feedback loop from what it's actually producing to adjusting the input. So for example, if the output is supposed to be intellectual information and the company realizes we haven't had a new patent in over a year, then we're actually going to be reacting to that information. We're going to be reacting to the fact that we're no longer producing our outputs. So the feedback loop to the environment is we need to change our inputs if we're going to have an impact on that output. So that feedback may inform us we need to hire new and fresh people with brand new ideas. Maybe we need to find a company that has very successful patents and find a few of their researchers and see if we can convince them to come to work for us. So that's just a very good example of a small little micro version of that feedback loop. But a good organization is going to have a strong, robust section of each of these four parts. It's going to have a strong inputs, it's bringing in what it needs. It's going to have a well-structured transformational process to change those inputs into outputs that will make the company successful. It's going to have outputs that the environment actually desires, and it's going to be analyzing and gathering information about how those products, how those outputs are reacted to by the environment to further feedback or inform changes in the organization. So, most organizational development is going to be focused on one of these four areas. Is it a problem with inputs? Is it a problem with transformation, or often referred to as throughputs? Is it a problem with outputs, or is it a problem with a feedback loop? So, do we need to change how we gather things from the environment? Do we need to change processes once they're in our organization? Do we need to change the products that we're actually producing? Or do we need to change how we actually analyze or gather information about our business from the environment? So just some quick signs that OD, organizational development, is needed, and this is taken from Burke's 1994 article. Basically, if we have same reoccurring problems, so if there's not a constant critical problem that's always occurring, but there is a problem that keeps reoccurring, generally that's an indication that there's something in the process system that gets overwhelmed. So there's something that works most of the time, but then at certain points, so for example, if there's always during inventory, basically customer service always dips and we get a bunch of complaints. Well, that isn't affecting the organism or the organization from an open systems framework all of the time. It's not a continuous problem, but it's a reoccurring problem. Low morale with an unclear cause. So, generally speaking, the people that actually make up an organization, the human resources organization, are one of your best thermometers, if you will, about problems in the organization. Because if the organization is doing well, it's running smoothly, and everyone feels as if their work is contributing to a success, you're usually going to find also high morale, high job satisfaction, and high commitment in the organization. When these numbers come down, it's usually because there's systems and processes that are being poorly perceived by the actual employees of the organization. Closed communication loops. So one of the first things we often look for when an organization is having problems is what are the lines of communication. So we've got a reoccurring problem where we have low morale. One of the things we also want to look at is there open communication through all levels of the organization, or is it closed? Closed communication generally means that you've turned off one of the parts of your feedback loop. You're no longer gathering information and sharing information throughout the organization, which is giving people the ability to actually react to change. Not dealing with conflict openly. So, again, if an organization has an issue where conflict is usually avoided, it's not brought to the table, it's not brought in the open, that again, you're closing down processes which would allow an organization to flow better and to react to changing situations. Decision making is not shared or never implemented. So, again, what's the decision making in the organization? Is it very dictatorial? That's usually going to result again in closing down of communication. Or is decisions just never being done? So the organization has become so change resistant that the decisions are always just put off. And also efforts to increase productivity that don't take. So if you have an organization that is kind of spinning its wheels, it's trying to affect organizational change, but it never really seems to have any impact. All of these are good signs that organizational development is needed, because what these indicate these are red flags for problems of an organization that isn't naturally flowing through a dynamic system of open systems. And organizational development will be a good process to identify not only is there a problem, but where is the problem and how can we change it successfully in a way that will, quote unquote, take. So just again, this is another way to visualize, and we're going to talk about a lot of models. And the reason that we talk about models in organizational development is what we're really wanting to do is to create graphics that are easily understood by both us to help us conceptualize organizational problems, but also to let us communicate these ideas as well. So you're learning about organizational development, but if you are actually going to do organizational development in your organization, you're going to become the teacher of trying to teach others what is this process, how does it look at organizations, and how is that useful for us making meaningful change or change management. So again, I've been talking about the environment in open systems, this idea that there's the organization and then everything outside is the environment, and the feedback loop is kind of taking information about the environment and reacting to it. But another way to look at the organizations, the environment, is what is the main components. So employees or unions are a part of the organization, but they're also a part of the environment. We bring in employees from outside the organization. We may have restrictions on how we can hire and promote employees based on unions and also state and government laws. Our competitors are a part of that environment that we want to be monitoring. What are our competitors doing? We want to benchmark off of them. In other words, what processes of theirs are working? Where are they succeeding that we aren't? And how can we adapt to that? Our customers. Every customer is going to be in the environment until they start actually shopping with us. And even as they interact with us in that way, they're now at least a part of the process in that they are taking the resources that we produce. They're actually consuming what the company produces. They're still more part of the environment than the organization. Governments, regulations, trade unions, all of these can impact organizations. Stockholders. So, stockholders, again, kind of exist both within and exterior of the organization because they're usually not directly tied to the inputs, the throughputs, or the outputs, but they can impact how an organization is going to function depending on whether they're pleased or not and how well their stock are doing. Our suppliers can control access and also can impact the way that we bring in inputs into the organization. And finally, the culture and society as a whole is worth knowing. So, for example, the smoking industry has to be very aware of how perceptions of smoking has changed over the years. 30 to 40 years ago, it was very easy for them to advertise, and in fact, they didn't even need to advertise. Almost every movie showed cool, suave people smoking. That was a very positive societal, cultural aspect for their industry. They are now seen as a negative. It is fairly rare to see people smoking in movies, and when they do, it's often an indication that there's something a little wrong with them, or they may even be a villain. So again, the society has changed, and that organization has had to adjust to that changing environment. So what is OD? OD is a long-range effort, a long-range plan of a programs or a series of programs. So generally speaking, when we're trying to identify OD from smaller interventions or smaller impacts, different ways to actually look at organizational issues, so a lot of HR practices and training, a single training program is rarely going to be OD. Because usually OD is going to be a long range effort of multiple programs trying to move the actual organization on a larger scale. The purpose is to improve organizational survival. So again, organizational development comes very strongly from this viewpoint or theory-based view of the world that organizations are open systems and that we are trying to actually make the organization, into a more healthy, more successful creature that is processing inputs through rigorous, or taking out inputs rigorously taking them through the most effective way to go through the throughputs and to create outputs the environment wants. It's a planned process, it's typically organizational wide, and it's often managed from the top. So let me just go through those 3 points. If you have a knee-jerk reaction to an organizational problem, so it's all hands on deck, we need to change this today, it's probably not technically OD. It may be very similar to OD, but OD is usually not reactionary. It's preparatory. It is doing it ahead of time. There's a problem, but we're not reacting to the problem with an immediate fix. We're looking at it as more of a continuous process of improvement. So good OD, it never stops. It is always looking for, is there anything in the environment that's changing? Is there anything we need to do to change our organization to better fit that environment? So it's a planned process. The second part is that it's organizational wide. Generally, organizational development is going to be focused on large, sweeping changes throughout the actual structure or open systems of the process. It's also usually going to be managed from the top. So again, this is kind of a way to differentiate organizational development from other kinds of programs that may be just targeting one set of individuals, one small part of the organization. This is usually being driven by a recognition of top-level C-suite management that the organization itself needs sweeping change. The purpose is to increase organizational effectiveness through measurable outcomes, through planned interventions, and using behavioral science knowledge. So that pre-test, what were we at as far as our outcomes before we intervened? What does the science say about what the intervention should look like and what interventions have been successful in the past in this particular problem? And now, do we actually see an improvement in whatever metrics or outcomes we are trying to affect? So the characteristics of OD, and this is from the book, basically change. So one of the big things that OD is, it's about changing organization. Change is planned by managers to achieve goals. So generally, most of the intervention is going to come from the top. We're changing the structure of the organization. We're changing a part of how we do business. We're changing a part of how we do training. We're doing a part of retention. And as a part of that, we're going to have interventions usually that are going to move through the actual management to achieve these goals. It's a collaborative approach. So it involves not just though it's being driven by the actual top stakeholders of an organization, a part of good OD is identifying communication. So if you remember a few slides ago, we were talking about red flags indicating the need for OD, and a good chunk of them were directive or dictatorial decision making, and another one was poor lines of communication. So OD by its very nature is going to also almost always have a part of its component of being increasing the collaborative approach. It's going to have a performance orientation, so we're not doing this to simply change the organization for change's sake. We're doing it to improve and enhance performance. It's going to have a humanistic orientation, emphasis on increasing opportunities and use of the human potential. So if we're focused on almost any aspect of an organization, whether it's how we bring things in, how we do things once they're in the organization, or the outputs, part of that is going to be a function of how people are actually behaving in the organization. It is going to have a systems approach, so we're going to be looking at the relationship among elements and the excellence within the organization. But what that really refers to is recognizing that when we change any one part of an organization, there is going to be ripple effects, and we want to think about those before we actually implement the changes. And finally, it's going to have scientific methodology behind it. We're going to be doing pre-tests. We're going to be doing empirical research to determine how we're actually going to do these interventions. And we're going to be doing post-tests to find out, is there a meaningful difference in our actual intervention. So why OD? The reasons for beginning change programs, our levels of competition have changed, the environment has changed, and the organization is starting to worry about survival, or just improved performance. So the first two were generally reactionary, and I said that organizational development shouldn't be reactionary. But again, when I'm talking about it there, it can definitely be driven by a need to change. So the competition has changed. So for instance, BlackBerry definitely needed to change its structures when the iPhone first came out. The level of competition, we're the only smartphone out there compared to there's now a smartphone that is quantifiably different than our product, but is also being marketed very differently, and is that going to be a problem? Now, in the case of BlackBerry, they completely missed these cues, and it resulted in basically the collapse of their business. But an organizational development at that point is still going to be driven, so the change is being driven by the event, but if it's OD, it would still be this systematic and planned process. Hopefully, most OD is going to live on that third point, improved performance. So we're not reacting to an emergency in the environment. We're reacting to trying to be preventative. We're wanting to actually be looking ahead. What are the changes that are coming, and how can we adapt to them? And the primary goals of any change program is to change the corporate culture, to become more adaptive, and to increase competitiveness. And just recognize again, when I say change the corporate culture, that is recognizing again those psychological constructs. That people have expectations of how the organization is structured and how it functions. And when we're doing organizational change, some of the resistance to that change is going to be people that are basically assuming that our changes are violating those psychological constructs. So we need to be aware of them, and we need to be thinking about how are we going to change those perceptions as well. And that's usually referred to broadly as the organizational culture. The idea of organizational development also usually isn't just the single change we're working on, it's also creating an open line of communication, better structures within the organization for decision making that allows that organization to welcome additional changes in the future. And of course, the final goal is to increase competitiveness in the environment. So one of the assumptions of organizational development is the only constant is change, and change is a moving target. Basically the idea that today's managers need a new mindset of not doing things the way they've always been done, but looking at how do we become flexible, how do we quickly change when necessary, and how can we innovate? Because there are going to be constantly changing conditions in almost every business setting. Whether it is a stable production of our technology really isn't changing, but even our client base and what they want may change, or even laws or product availability. Kind of a weird example of this that pops into my mind is that the actual party balloon business has had to make changes, not because the desire for balloons at parties has changed. It hasn't. It's been pretty stable for many, many years. Balloons, especially floating balloons, have been associated with parties. But what changed is actually there has been a fluctuating availability of helium, the gas that's used to make a balloon float. And so the party balloon industry has often been in sections where it's hard to get balloons because they don't have the raw materials, and there's nothing they can do about that. Basically, supply is below demand. So a lot of those industries have had to adapt, not because there's a change in any environment or law or what the customer wants, but because how are we going to still make money? What alternate products can produce when we are running out of the actual core element that we need to actually create our core product? So successful firms share these traits, and this is just something I want to kind of think about, is that generally speaking, when we're talking about organizational development, a part of that is that benchmarking. And benchmarking can also just be a broad model of what does a good organization look like. And a good organization isn't necessarily just one that is successful. It's one that's successful that also will be able to roll with punches or adapt to new environments. So generally speaking, most successful firms, so firms that are consistently getting a better market share, consistently on a growth pattern, consistently having stock that is a good return on investment, generally are faster in the way they react to changes. They're focused on quality. They're involving their employees in a way where the employees have open lines of communication, or at least involved in the decision making, are very focused on customers, and that customer orientation, it isn't just a phrase. It means that they're monitoring what do our customers want. They're focused on their environment. And typically, they're somewhat smaller. They're not large and bureaucratic. Now, some organizations have to be large and bureaucratic in order to do the work that they do. But just recognize that as you add size, as you add hierarchy, as you add bureaucracy, you are also making an organization that is going to be less reactive to change. So the organizations of the 21st century tend to be faster, focused on quality, involving their employees, and customer oriented and smaller. And a part of this then involves that model of those five factors means that they are more able to deal with competitive uncertainty, so changes in regulations, changes in prices, changes in supplies. They're more able to react to new competitors, both domestic and multinational, entering into their market space. They can change based on changing consumers' desires, lifestyles, and trends, and also changes in technology. So that pretty much wraps up this first module. I'll be talking to you again as we move to Module 2 of the first week of this class.